Oh, yeah.
Jack, let's see if you can hear me.
Here, do you want one?
Oh, sure. Try if you can hear me. Is that pretty excellent? If you're having, that's true, that's true. Well, if you've been to first service, you already know what this means, so I'm not going to give that away. So let us begin with a word of prayer. Faithful God who journeys with us, you have called your servants to ventures of which we cannot see the ending, by paths as yet untrodden, through perils unknown. Give us faith to go out with good courage, not knowing where we go, but only that your hand is leading us and your love is supporting us. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So welcome. This is Pastor Justin Part 2. The last session was much more about kind of me and my story, kind of where we're coming from, some of our passions and why we do what we do. And this is something that is near and dear to my heart. So this is a really big passion. As you know, after serving as a missionary for 7 years, you start to think, you think in different ways, sometimes, and with new logics and new worldviews. And this is something that really changed my whole way of being a pastor. It really started for me in 2007 when Carrie and I went on a pilgrimage in Spain. We walked across Spain the month of July, and I realized that in order to authentically be a pastor, I needed to learn to walk with people. That you can't really walk your own pace, you walk as a community. And so this really dovetailed well with the accompaniment model whenever we became missionaries. And so the reason I present this is this gives you some of my philosophy and theology of how I am as a pastor. You may not see it explicitly, but it's always kind of implicitly part of who I am and how I'm thinking, and how I understand church. So as we start, when you see the word accompaniment, what do you think? Like what comes to mind?
Music.
Music? In what sense?
Well, kind of an instrument accompanying a singer.
Okay.
Walking side by side?
Walking side by side.
Blending together.
Say what?
Blending.
Blending together. Yeah. So accompaniment is all of that. And it's really, the way they understand it in the ELCA, is it's walking with people in solidarity that leads to transformation, empowerment, and sustainability. So really it is that walking with, that accompaniment piece, that we're doing this together. And this has been the mission model of the ELCA since the late 90s. It really grew out of the Latin American Caribbean context. So it comes kind of like liberation theology. This too comes from a Latin American perspective. Comes from a perspective of people who walk, who literally walk with each other. And within accompaniment, there are really 5 values. There's mutuality, inclusivity, vulnerability, empowerment, and sustainability. The 2 that are kind of pushed over, inclusivity and empowerment, they kind of speak for themselves. Inclusivity, looking for who is excluded and asking why. Committing to changing structures and habits that exclude people in hurtful ways. And then empowerment, we know what empowerment is. It recognizes asymmetries of power. So in global mission, there's always an asymmetry of power. Somebody always has money, and usually someone doesn't have money. And money is a huge asymmetrical thrower of power. And so in empowerment, we recognize asymmetries of power and relationships, and we work to rebalance that. We work to stand up to structures that hurt those with less power, and so we really strive to work with empowering, and instead of doing it for, we do with and empower through. So those are those 3, but those 2. So the other 3 that we'll really focus on in our time is mutuality, vulnerability, and sustainability. So mutuality is basically that. We work to recognize that all of us have gifts. A lot of this is influenced by the Brazilian pedagogue Paulo Freire, who has a methodology of education called popular education. And he says that everyone has something to teach and everyone has something to learn. No one is an empty vessel. And so even in my Bible studies that I'll lead, I often start with what experience do you have? Because we each have our own unique experience, and that's really what grounds our lenses and everything that we do with our faith. So it recognizes that all have a gift to offer in God's mission, and there's a value in the gift of all. It's built upon giving and receiving trust as we grow together, and there's a focus on reciprocal relationships. So sometimes it can feel unilateral. So mutuality really focuses on making it be a two-way street, a reciprocal relationship, so that both communities can have the relationship and that the capacity is built up, and it breaks the emphasis off of donor-recipient. I know in the next coming, I think it's next weekend, when we'll talk about Gifts of Hope, the Global Mission in Action. And so think of that as we think of breaking down models of donor-recipient, because that's an imbalance of power, right? So mutuality really focuses on breaking the inequity and the inequality of that. Also, there's vulnerability. Within the U.S. culture, vulnerability is often seen as weakness. But Jesus shows us that vulnerability is an openness to relationship, a giving up of power. I think it's in Philippians when there's the word kenosis, when it talks about Jesus emptying himself. And while it's kind of graphic to think of it, that's really how Jesus understood his ministry, is emptying himself, becoming vulnerable. And so we enter God's mission through vulnerability. Just as Jesus became vulnerable to us, we also become vulnerable when we engage in mission. We also practice receiving hospitality. As North Americans, often that's difficult, because we always want to be the one who brings something. And we feel, oh, I should have brought something to that dinner. But it's okay to receive hospitality. It's okay because by being hospitable, you're receiving the gifts of others. And so that means being vulnerable. You have to give up the control of your experience and open yourselves to reflection, change, and the key word you'll hear in the sermon today is transformation. Open yourself up to being transformed by the other. And then sustainability. We recognize that in any relationship, it requires a commitment to attention. Time to build up all those who are involved so that it happens over the long haul. So that it's not kind of a one-off thing that something happens and it stays with one person, but rather it's a ministry that's shared over the long term. So it doesn't remain on just one person. Accompaniment then isn't something we just do globally, but rather it's how we are with our sisters and brothers in Christ. It's how you are with people from different cultures here in Lincoln, or at First. And it's how we stand in solidarity with and walk alongside others, especially who are from a marginalized community, as we live together with God's reconciling love. There's a quote, you may hear me talk about Anthony Giddens. He's a Catholic theologian, was a missiologist from Chicago. And he fundamentally kind of racked my brain about what it means to be in mission. And so I quote him often. And he has a quote, he says, "To love, you must encounter." We can't truly know, much less love in the abstract, because human encounter, meeting each other, is the only authentic way to know and to love. To love each other. It's how we encounter each other. So, encountering. What's going on in this image? What do you notice? There's a tiny mouse and a big elephant. Yeah. What else do you notice? He's feeding. Which of these two is courageous? Because isn't it an old wives' tale that elephants are afraid of mice? Who has more power in this image? Sorry if I'm... Who is the giver and who is the receiver? Go ahead, say it. I'm interested. The mouse is the giver and the elephant's the receiver. Are they eye to eye? So what does this image have to do with accompaniment and mission? Just from what I've said so far, what does this image tell us about accompaniment and mission? Be present, okay. Take a risk.
Setting aside they're vulnerable.
They're vulnerable to each other, yeah.
The mouse is out of his realm.
Mouse is out of his realm. That's true. Is there mutuality in this relationship? Some would say so. So I'm going to tell you a story. A story called Elephant and Mouse. It's a story by Miriam Adney, and she says, "Let me tell you a story about Americans. An African Christian friend said to me, 'Elephant and Mouse were best friends. One day, Elephant said, 'Mouse, let's have a party.' So the animals gathered from far and near. They ate, they drank, they sang, and they danced. And nobody danced more and danced harder than Elephant. After the party was over, Elephant exclaimed, 'Mouse, did you ever go to a better party? What a blast!' But Mouse didn't answer. 'Mouse, Mouse, where are you?' Elephant called. He looked for his friend and shrank back in horror. There at Elephant's feet lay Mouse. His little body was ground into the dirt. He had been smashed by the big feet of his exuberant friend, Elephant. Sometimes this is what it's like to do mission with you Americans," the African storyteller commented. "It's like dancing with an elephant." It's true. We experience this as missionaries, that sometimes we get so, yes, we're going to do mission, we're going to do mission, we're going to do mission. You look around, you're like, where are our hosts? And so mutuality comes in, and this is what happens when mutuality and accompaniment, or even understanding the other, isn't present in a relationship. Each needs to be aware of their other's reality, the context, power, importance, and struggles. Mutuality is about developing and deepening horizontal reciprocal relationships where trust and openness and honesty are key. Mutuality is much more about partnership and collaboration, like that one. But it's a process. Vulnerability. What's the first thing that comes to mind when you hear the word vulnerable or vulnerability?
Weakness.
Weakness.
Risk.
Risk.
Fear.
Fear. Okay. Honesty.
Hurt.
Hurt.
That lack of protection.
Lack of protection. Yeah. We realized when we lived in Bolivia that because it's chilly, we always wore a coat or a vest or something. And to be honest, that's why I'm wearing this vest, because we realized that when you wear more clothes, you feel more protected, right? So even when I first became a pastor, and I would always get nervous in front of people. I still get nervous, even after years of being a pastor. And I had to tell myself when I first became a pastor, it's okay, they cannot eat you. Because, seeing people in underwear, that doesn't work, or, imagining people not that doesn't work either. So I had to think of my almost as kind of this protection, this coat of armor that you can't eat me. So then I can do, if we're standing behind an altar, you can't see our knees shake either. But it doesn't mean that we're not vulnerable. When I first came here, they said, can you chant? I can. Doesn't mean it's good, but I can. Oh, who would like you to? Okay. So it's being vulnerable. It's stepping outside of your comfort zone. It's risk being wrong and doing a crappy job and failing horribly and getting up and doing it again and doing it again. And I realized that if I failed in the grace of God. And if I succeeded in the grace of God. Either way, I was going to be in the grace of God, whether it worked or didn't. And so vulnerability is a key piece of this. So everyone has a little sheet of paper. At least you should. That you were given, and a pencil. And so I want you to draw Luther's rose, the Luther seal. They no cheating. Don't look at your neighbors and don't ask for help. This is easy. Draw if you know what Luther's seal looks like, please. Or Luther's rose is called.
No.
Okay, we got something down, stick figures. Okay, so I'll draw as you explain to me. What do you start with first? What's in the middle? What's next? And next?
Flower petals?
Huh?
Flower petals?
A white rose. Okay, what's next?
A circle.
And what's next?
Gold band.
A gold ring.
That's something, but that's
That. So what we commonly call us. I made it hard, didn't I? Yeah, this is Luther's seal, or Luther's rose. And often I teach Lutheran identity by breaking apart, because really there's four major parts. There's a cross and a heart and a flower and a circle, which is the sky. And when you break all four pieces apart, it looks different. And I often teach kind of catechism from each of the pieces and what it means from nature to humans to God to kind of all of creation. But in Luther's seal is, let's see, I missed my part. What's at the heart of our Lutheran image? Our Lutheran heritage, our Lutheran identity. What's at the heart? The cross. At the heart of our Lutheran identity is vulnerability. The vulnerability of Christ crucified. Our vulnerability of being Christ-like. So this is what Luther said when he created this, and he wrote to the Nuremberg city clerk, Lazarus Spengler, in 1530. He wrote this to explain the seal. Just a part. He said, the first should be a black cross in a heart, which retains its natural color, so that I myself would be reminded that faith in the crucified saves us. For one who believes from the heart will be justified. Although it is indeed a black cross which mortifies and which should also cause pain, it leaves the heart in its natural color. It does not corrupt nature. That is, it does not kill, but keeps one alive. The just shall live by faith, but by faith in the crucified. One of my other professors in seminary, his name was Vitor Vestele. He's a Brazilian Lutheran theologian. He wrote an article that changed my world called Transfiguring Lutheranism, Being Lutheran in a New Context. And he wrote this. He wrote, we live in a world that is broken and damaged. And our identity as Lutherans does not lie in the laudatory proficiency of reciting articles from the Small Catechism or in the Augsburg Confession, but in our willingness to be vulnerable, so that while being immersed in the traditions of the church, our theologizing is one that allows the cries of the broken, forsaken, and frail to interrupt our traditioned listening so that God's voice might be heard. Us being Lutheran doesn't have anything to do with necessarily the Augsburg Confession or our ability to do something. It's in our willingness to be vulnerable, to be changed. So vulnerability helps us to be transparent with one another and break down barriers that control or inhibit relationship. Vulnerability isn't weakness, but it is sometimes giving up something to be transformed by the other. Now, there is a disclaimer that I'm speaking to you from one as a dominant culture. And I'm speaking to a critique to the church of a dominant culture. Because we know that vulnerability for oppressed and marginalized folk may look and feel and manifest itself differently. So as people who have power, vulnerability is key. Sometimes we hold on to an obstacle, privilege, power, race, whatever you want to say. We hold on to it so tightly, whether consciously or unconsciously, that it inhibits authentic relationship. It keeps us from being vulnerable. And so this vulnerability, this five values, this value of accompaniment is crucial. And it's what this whole thing of being in relationship hinges on. And so my point with is that vulnerability is an openness to relationship, a giving up of power to hear and be moved by the cries of the broken and the forsaken. Authentic engagement and relationship can only come about when we're ready and willing to open ourselves to being vulnerable. At the center of who we are as Lutherans and as Christians is the cross is vulnerability, because God works and redeems through vulnerability. So another example, when we arrived at the end of August in 2009 to Bolivia, and in September they said, oh, by the way, Pastor Justin, you're going to be teaching at the seminary. Do what? You're going to be teaching, so it was all in Spanish, and I said, oh, really? Do tell more. And they said, yeah, you're going to be teaching in seminary. So I had just finished seminary and was now going to be teaching it. And they said, well, what classes would you like to teach? And I thought, oh, that's an open invitation. And I said, well, what classes did I like the most? I liked church history. I liked New Testament. I was better in Greek, and I liked worship and liturgy. Oh, good. You'll teach all those. So, and I'm not a trained teacher, so I went to the expert that I lived with, which is my wife, Carrie, and I said, how do I make a lesson plan? and I spent a whole year, because every quarter, so it was every trimester, I was teaching a new course. And so I translated, thanks be to God, I took my seminary notes with me, and so I translated from my notes, all of my seminary notes to Spanish, and then taught from those. But I realized, even with that I had learned in a very specific way of how to teach church history. It was very one way. It was very unilateral, the learning that I had learned in seminary. I had a professor who stood like this and lectured. And just lectured. So I was like, well, I guess that's what I do to teach church history. So I did it that way until halfway through midterm. And on their midterm, I put an evaluation. I said, okay, folks, because so seminary in La Paz was second career folks who weren't going to be paid as pastors, so they were going on their own faith and voluntad, their will, and it was from 7 to 10 at night. Yeah, and so these are folks that they just felt really called to be pastors, and we had kind of fundamentalist Christian theologies mixed with Roman Catholic theologies, with a peppering of Presbyterian and Methodism and Lutheranism all in one church history, one class, from Jesus to the Reformation, 1,500 years in 19 weeks. I was like, oh boy. So at the midterm, I put an evaluation. I said, so folks, is this working or not? Because Carrie said, you need to do an evaluation. And they said, no, this is not working. Okay. Well, so I also asked them for suggestions. And they gave me suggestions. They said, we're a culture that's, while we are an oral culture, we're not a lecturing culture. Okay. So that meant that everything after that became dynamic, a game, something fun that had to be tactile. So instead of giving a lecture on the Council of Constantinople, or the Council of Nicaea, they actually redid the debate. They rehashed it. Was Mary the mother of God, the carrier of God, or the carrier of Jesus? And I let them decide, and then I said, okay, now here's what church history says, and this is what tradition has said. And I never taught church history again with dates and places and names so much as it was movements and reasons why the church transformed over time, almost cyclically. So I had to be vulnerable. There were times when even speaking in Spanish, I didn't know the word. I remember the day I couldn't remember the word, and I was like, that word, it's a thief of the sea. What's a thief of the sea? What's the word? Thief of the sea. A pirate. Yeah, I couldn't think of the word pirate. And so I'm standing there in front of my class thinking, why can't I not think of pirate? I'm so stupid. But it's being vulnerable. It's not having all the answers. And so as I taught for 4 years, I slowly learned, because what I realized was that while Spanish was my second language, Spanish was also my students' second language. Their first language was Quechua or Aymara. And so we were learning and teaching through our second languages. Now that does have its advantages and disadvantages, as you can imagine, but it meant that we were vulnerable together. They were willing to say, yeah, Pastor Justin doesn't speak Spanish perfectly or with the same pronunciation, but we're in it together. We're going to do this together. So that was one of my experiences with vulnerability. So sustainability. Raise your hand if you've ever heard this axiom. Give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. Raise your hand if you've heard that. Yeah, and it is true. If you give a kid a fish, it's going to die. So have a story ready. That's a guarantee. Yeah. So a quick quiz for you. Who said that quote? Was it A, Lao Tzu, a Chinese philosopher? Was it Maimonides, a Spanish philosopher? Or was it Anna Isabel Ritchie, a British author? So we'll start this way. Raise your hand if you think it's Lao Tzu, who said, give a man a fish, you feed him, or how did it go? Give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, teach a man to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. Raise your hand if you think it's A. Raise it high, be proud and vulnerable. Okay. Raise your hand if you think it's B. Oh, come on, don't be weary. Okay. Raise your hand if you think it's C. Great. The answer is we actually don't know. However, it was Miss Ritchie who wrote in 1880. She wrote a story called Mrs. Diamond, sometime in the 1880s, and it included this line. He certainly doesn't practice his precepts, but I suppose the patron meant that if you give a man a fish, he is hungry again in an hour. If you teach him to catch a fish, you do him a good turn. But we really don't know. And while we may know this old axiom, we need to take it a step further. We may be comfortable with how it is now. Give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. Teach him to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. But how does it look and sit if we go deeper past comfortable? If you teach me to fish, you have fed me for a day, or until the river is overfished or polluted, or the shoreline is seized for development by corporations. But if you teach me to organize, then whatever the challenge, I can gather together with my community and peers, and we will fashion our own solution. It sounds a little different, you know? That's taking it a step further. This adds a much more community organizing spirit to that same axiom. But even with this axiom, we really must read it with the hermeneutic of suspicion, which means be critical and think, something's not right about this. And ask who is doing the teaching and who is doing the learning. Is it the dominant culture who's doing the teaching? Is it a foreign companion church doing the learning? Who is teaching and who is learning? Really, the original axiom smells a little like patriarchy and imperialism and individualism and superiority, because it says nothing about his wife or his community. It's one person. It also assumes that the person knows nothing about fishing. But as a missionary and as ELCA Global Mission, who accompany our companions around the world, we've had to really go against this, especially with sustainability. And we've learned to stop and listen, and to sit down with our companion communities and listen as they share about how important the river is to them, about their health and their well-being, about their children and grandchildren, and listen to stories about how it was when they were hungry, what life was like before their rivers were overfished or became polluted. Our companion sisters and brothers around the world are not poor recipients of our donated charity fish, nor are they students of our fishing expertise, because they are co-teachers. They are co-fisher people, fishermen and fisherwomen, and they have something to tell us that will feed us too. This sounds different, doesn't it? It smells like sustainability. It's not so one-sided, and it's over the long term. So one of the ways that the ELCA, whenever they have a World Hunger Project, you've heard of ELCA World Hunger, and even the way those come about is not that the ELCA goes and says, oh, we see what you need, so we're going to create a project and give you money, and you do it. The World Hunger Grants and projects are created based on the companion church's need. And they say, we've got these resources already, and we have this need in our community, but we don't have this little piece to help us make it real. So do you all know the story of Stone Soup? How's it go? Can you summarize it for me?
There are very different versions.
Oh, there are different versions.
We read them last week. It's in Canada.
Oh,
But it's about travelers who go to a town and ask people to give them food, and no one will. And then they say, look, I have this magic stone, I can make soup from it. And everyone's fascinated by this idea of this magical stone, so they put it in water, and obviously nothing, it's just water with a stone in it. And they're like, oh, wouldn't it taste better with some vegetables? And magically people have vegetables to share, and different people bring a little bit from each of their households, and together it makes a great soup.
stone soup. So it's community soup. Well, that's how really the ELCA sees World Hunger projects and grants. It's not that we from some 10th floor office in Chicago think of, oh, you really would be helpful with this project. But it's people who say, like for example, on the border between Paraguay and Argentina, there's such awful issues with gender-based domestic violence and human trafficking that they said we need a program to work with women and children to recognize and prevent domestic violence. That they can recognize it and give a voice to the voiceless. That's what the church said. And so they said, we have these coordinators who are trained and ready to go. And we have these group of women and children who are ready to learn. And we have the facility ready. And we have the times and the schedule and the curriculum already planned out. What we really need is bus passage. Oh, exactly. Oh. And so they wrote a grant. And that became a World Hunger Project that is actually it's much larger than that. But that's the concept, that's the idea of sustainability, because it's the stone soup philosophy that everybody brings something to the table. And the ELC is not the one that just has everything, a magic bag of like Hermione's purse where everything just keeps pulling out and pulling out. And so that's how we as the ELC do World Hunger projects. And that's how we do missionaries. We don't send missionaries just willy-nilly, oh, we think somebody would be fun to live in Sri Lanka. No, usually the companion church says we have a need, and so we will write a job description. And we've searched here, and can you help us with a person and a salary so that that doesn't take away from our church resources? And that's how often missionaries go in the ELCA. So with sustainability, it's not necessarily from the northern hemisphere, but asking for help is something that takes vulnerability. It means recognizing that you don't have everything. And a lot of what we do in the ELCA is for sustainable, with sustainability in mind. And I think really even as a congregation, we would think of Christian ed programs, and we think of programming and projects, things that are sustainable, so it's not a one-time thing. Sometimes there are reasons for projects to have a beginning and an end, a definite, done, yay, hooray. But sometimes if it's long-term, we think of sustainability, so it's not a drain on the resources of the system, and where everybody feels a part of it. In Bolivia, there was the idea of motorbikes. And they said, oh, you know what? We have the missionaries and we have the churches, but what we need are motorbikes. Motorcycles. Can you help us with the motorcycles? And we said, well, that seems easy enough, but you're asking for motorcycles. Yeah. Who's going to pay for the gas? Oh. And who's going to repair it if it breaks? Oh. And who's going to keep the insurance? Because you know that one person's they're going to have 5 people on the motorcycle. So who's going to pay for insurance if somebody falls off and breaks an arm or dies? Oh. And then we said, we're not saying no to a motorcycle, but we're saying go back to the drawing board. Keep thinking about it. But for right now, the answer is we think this ministry can happen without a motorcycle. Because often what we think of as a great idea, wow, we should send laptops to Africa. Well, what happens when power's cut off? Or there's only power in the village for 2 hours. Everybody runs and does their thing. Well, usually it doesn't happen that fast. So when we think of things, while it may feel like a really great gesture on our part, it's often that we need to think of, is this sustainable? Is this make sense there, since it's not here? So, the 5 values of accompaniment are mutuality, inclusivity, vulnerability, empowerment, and sustainability. What spaghetti is still stuck to the wall for you? What comments, questions? And there was a story of a church who did a campaign to gather hand sanitizer, put it in crates, shipped it to Africa. And they said, yay, we're going to come and see our companions, we're going to come and see you. It's so great. And when the mission trip got there, they saw a crate full of hand sanitizer. People said, we don't need to be sanitized, you can take that home. And there's another story. There's really a lot of missionary stories. There's another story of a group in the U.S. who went over to Africa, and they visited a village, and they said, "Oh, you don't have a school. We're going to build a school. We're going to build a school." They went home, raised a bunch of money, went back over, built a school, or sent money to build a school. And when they went over to visit this school that they had built, they said, "There's a bunch of hospital beds in there. And IVs hanging everywhere." "What? We built you a school." They said, "You never asked us if we needed a school. We needed a hospital more than we needed a school." So often those kind of mission stories, I don't know if I told you last or 2 weeks ago, in Costa Rica there's a church that they know there's a lot of visitors from North America that like to come and do mission projects. And so they keep this fence on the lot there. And people come and say, "Oh, we see what you need. You need that fence painted. We're going to paint that fence. We're going to bring all our paint. We're going to..." They all get their picture taken beside the pretty fence. Look at what we did. And when they leave, the church says, "Ooh," and they get their paint thinner and they strip it down for the next group, because the next group comes and says, "Look, you have a fence that needs to be painted. We're going to come and paint it." Because sometimes mission trips focus on painting the fence, and the people are like, "Hello? We're here too." So often these are, I wish I could make up stuff this good, but these are true stories of when accompaniment, and that's what sold me on the accompaniment model, is it means walking with each other. And when we first struggled with it, because the idea is you don't walk in front of your companion and you don't walk behind them. You walk side by side. You struggle with them. You can't really fix their problems because it's not your problem to fix, nor are you really the person to fix their problem. That's Great White Savior syndrome. And what they said was, and I said, well, giving the idea that if you see your companion running towards a cliff, what do I do? That's what I asked the ELCA. They said, well, you run along with them. And you say, "Here's a cliff coming. Hey, look, there's a cliff coming. Hey, there's a cliff coming. Might we think of something else?" And they said, when you get to that cliff, you stop, even if your companion goes over. And then you make your way down, and you get with your companion. You say, "That cliff was kind of high, wasn't it?" And you figure out with them a way to get back, and you keep moving. Because our way is not to say, "Stop, don't go over the cliff," because who are we to say don't go over the cliff? So we are with our companions in a vulnerable way, because it is too easy to give everything and solve the world's problems and give all the answers and dump boatloads of money over in other places. And we know what that does. That usually causes more problems than it helps. So accompaniment really calls us to being an authentic relationship. It's not perfect. It's quite messy. Especially when it comes to, and this was, as I was going through this, of how do we accompany our companions in the midst of a financial crisis or mismanagement of funds? What do we do when there's abuse, when there's domestic abuse or gender-based violence in the church structure? What do we do as the ELCA? And so we don't participate in that. And if anything, we speak truth to power of how that's not gospel-centered. And we don't ever walk away, but we also don't get into the mix. Because a church that I worked with, they said, "We don't want you to fix our problem. The problem was here before you got here. We just need to know that you're praying for us and that you're not going to leave us." Oh. So that, for me, then accompaniment, in the hardest of senses, it means not abandoning. You may not be able to actively walk side by side with the companion, because you really can't fully understand everything that they're going through. But it also doesn't mean that we walk away and say, "C'est la vie. Good luck." That would be, and that wouldn't be Christ-like, you know. But it also doesn't mean we get in their mess and try to fix it and, "Oh, you need to do this," or "Here's money for this," or "Hey, we need to fire that." We don't do that either. So that's when, for me, accompaniment really became, we don't walk away. We don't abandon.
It's interesting though that, I think the sensibility of a lot of mission work and a lot of our culture is fixing things. Like, that's why we do things, is we're gonna fix them. We're not gonna, like, what would you say? We're not just gonna go and be part of the problem, we're gonna fix the problem. So it really becomes harder to think through what mission work is all about.
And I think that's when for me, mission became a lifestyle, an attitude, and not so much something I did. Because if we understand mission as what God is up to in the world, because really it's not our mission ever, it's always God's mission. And we are participants in what God is up to in the world. For me, then that, it made sense to me that it wasn't always what I did, but it was more how I was, or how I am in relationship. That is also being part of the Missio Dei. If the mission of God is the reconciliation and restoration of the human community, then really doing is only a very small part, and it may be a manifestation of our being. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with what Patrick said, because our need to fix something gives us that sense of accomplishment, right? What you're describing to me is not an event, but a process.
Mhm.
It's forever. That's
Yeah.
harder.
Yeah, it's very hard. It's not impossible, but it takes more time. It's not an easy fix. That sounds cliche, but it's not. Being in mission together requires time and effort and energy. And that's why, for me, the ultimate accompaniment is not walking away. Because when you're like, just throw it in the bag, let's go. Those, historically, people around the world who have been historically oppressed and colonized and marginalized, everybody's thrown it in the bag. This ain't gonna work. I mean, think of the African nation, the African continent. Because Africa's a continent, just FYI. Some people still think it's a country. Africa's a continent. And so, to think of, it was just the 60s, or the Algerian, where's it laying? Algerian independence was in the 60s, right, from France?
Right, and in correct me on this, Patrick, I think it's 1970 that 60 countries were brought into the UN.
Right. So we have, within our lifetime, we still have, we're still seeing results of colonization and oppression of people. And the dictator Pinochet was in Chile until 1993. So the companion churches in Peru, in Argentina and Chile have a very post-dictatorship mindset. But it's not really post, because Pinochet set up his government after he left in order to still exist as a dictatorial system. So the church still exists within this, and we wonder why there's issues of trust and issues of infighting and issues of who's going to stab me in the back next. I mean, this is people's lived reality. So for me to come in and think, me, little old Justin, coming from North America, is going to fix something, was ludicrous. But it didn't get me off the hook of being with them and saying the EOC walks with you. However we can be of assistance, we will try our best to be with you as a companion church, to walk with you through the struggle, to help remind you that you are Christ, you are God's children, and we are in this mess together. And so that's why I did so much reconciliation workshops with churches that I visited, the national churches, because it was at the highest levels. It was their central offices that were having these issues. And so a lot of it was about trust. Really, if anything, it all comes down to trust. And trust takes a lot of time. It takes investment.
You've spoken a lot about how that looks like internationally, but now that you're living and working in the United States, how do you see that in Lincoln or in more local?
I haven't been here 6 months yet. I'm still being attentive. My smart sermon, if you already heard it, being attentive, being watchful, looking for it. Another piece that for me is goes with this, which there's not time today to do, it's a whole other presentation, is called interculturality. And it sounds really fancy. But we often hear of multicultural. Well, multicultural is nothing other than the obvious, there's multiple cultures together. Interculturality moves a step further and says there's a relationship. And so I have an image of two icebergs. And you know, an iceberg, you only see the top above the water. And so people often relate to each other from different cultures, just from that little piece you can see. But what really bumps into each other first is the huge iceberg that's under the water that you don't ever see. And so you have the chocas de cultura, you have a crashing of cultures. So within Lincoln, I think there's a good bit of effort being placed on accompaniment, whether they say it or not, on working with the refugee resettlement community with LFS, Lutheran Family Services, and even Lincoln Public Schools, I think, does accompaniment without using that word. It sounds very fancy, but it just means walking with, you know. As far as our congregation, I'm being attentive. I'm still building trust and learning you all, meeting you all. Because it takes years to build trust, right? So it takes time to build relationships to, that really wasn't a good answer. I'm being attentive, yes?
I was gonna say, to that point, that at least in, I mean, not locally, not so much locally here in Lincoln, but the Nebraska Synod, in their involvement in the Tri-Faith Initiative in Omaha, the campus at 132nd and Pacific, where they have a Christian church, a Jewish synagogue, and a Islamic mosque. I think that type of thing is the cultural thing, but it's also an accompaniment where they learn to walk with each other, find ways that they can serve the community together, ways that they can interact together.
Yeah, and like I said, there may be, as I get to know more of Lincoln, and we are together more, that I learn, you know. I do see accompaniment here. It's better here than in a lot of places. Yeah, that you're very smart people. You're very with it. That makes it good for me to be with folks. So, any last burning questions?
When did you understand this accompaniment as part of your mission work? Were you prepared for that as you became a missionary? They said this is what it is, or as you were out actually being a missionary?
All of the above. Yeah, accompaniment really is the model that the ELCA does mission around the world, or is in mission around the world. So I knew about it from previous experiences, but then reading kind of, because it's a whole theology of it. People tell the story of the road to Emmaus, as Jesus walking with us, and then we also walk with each other. For me, that's too easy. It's too gentle and too sanitized. And so accompaniment really is an understanding that as you get into it and you work, it becomes real. And as I said before, it becomes a lifestyle of walking with. So in my theology of accompaniment continues to develop even as I'm here at first. Because now we're walking together, and you're walking with me, which is, for me, and for us, is a great blessing. So I think we're time.
Any other questions?
Well, thank you very much for putting up with it.